like to talk to you about this subject that might help a lot of people: the ways God speaks. I think there's going to be some people that were not churched or have grown up in church, but they truly, something is stirring in them and they want to be able to hear from God. So I kind of want to go through the history of how God has spoken, how God speaks. I got 12 ways that I've personally gleaned from the Bible to share with you. And on this weekend, it's Easter weekend. Today is the day that he's in the grave doing his work. So, how does God speak? How can we recognize? Yesterday as I was cutting grass, I was thinking, if everyone's expecting God to speak a certain way, English, like I wants to speak to me in English, then we've limited and maybe we're not hearing the voice of God because we know God is speaking, has always been speaking. Ever since Genesis chapter 1, God spoke and things were created. So in the beginning, God is speaking. So then we have all the accounts in the Holy Scriptures of the ways God has interacted and spoken. So I wanted to go through that. And I wanted to start with the early ways, the big ways, and work our way down to what's happened since Jesus has done what he done this weekend, was crucified, buried, and resurrected. So the first one, God speaks audibly from heaven, right? He just speaks from heaven. Remember when Jesus was baptized? What happened right here? And it says that immediately coming up out of the water, Jesus being baptized, he saw heaven open and the Spirit, like a dove, descended upon him, and a voice came from heaven. Oh, it says heavens. You are my son, in you I am well pleased. But that's not the only case. Listen, like for example, now this whole series will be multiple videos, may not cover everything, all the verses, but I'm going to get the general sense. All right, so let's go back to Daniel 4:31. Check this out. King Nebuchadnezzar, right? While the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared. So there in the Old Testament, a voice boomed from heaven. Now, when God speaks from heaven, does everyone understand that's there when it's happening? Actually, the answer is no, which I find very interesting. And the reason I'm doing this series, I want to encourage everybody to be able to become aware that God is speaking, how he has spoken, and not to feel left out. So John 12, I got a notebook right here beside of me, right here. So John 12:28, God spoke from heaven in this case right here. Then a voice came out of heaven and said, I have both glorified it and I will glorify it again. So the crowd who stood by heard it. They heard this, and they were saying that it was a thunder. Others were saying maybe an angel was speaking to him. So then a voice, Jesus was there, speaks again from heaven, but not everybody was able to hear it. So Jesus responds and says, this voice has not come for my sake, but yours. Now judgment is upon this world. The ruler of this world will be cast out. Okay, so here, not everybody like, wow, is that thunder? There's an angel talking to him. A lot of people don't understand from this verse that they understand what God's speaking. Don't feel alone. We all are like, are we hearing God? That is a common question. So the first one was God speaks from heaven. Let me go to the second version. This is the historical accounts of God speaking. God speaks out of the storm, out of whirlwinds, pillars of fire. Basically, massive things. In Job 38:1, God speaks to Job out of the whirlwind. Could you imagine a black, dark tornado goes, Job, I am going to answer you. How terrifying would that be? And then in Psalms 99:7, the book of Psalms. This is good stuff. Man, I hope y'all get stuff out of this. I really enjoy this conversation. Psalms 99:7 confirms that God spoke to them in a pillar of cloud. They kept his testimonies and the statute that he gave them. Do you see that? Spoke out of the pillar of cloud. So God speaks out of the storm. Now, right there's a sermon. If you're a preacher, God speaks to you out of the storm. Can you hear the sermon in that? God speaks to you in the storm. And nope, I'm not going to go there. I want to start preaching it. But let's go to the next one. God speaks by the finger of God. Daniel 5:5, you know that a hand came and wrote, a visible hand, finger wrote on the wall, right? In Daniel 5:5. And also, it was the finger of God that wrote the 10 Commandments. So God will speak by his own handwriting. That's awesome. Daniel 5:5. This is the first one. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing, and then the king's face became pale. And if you read the rest of the story, what you find out is that the finger of God writing on the wall didn't know what it meant. They didn't understand. This is the second time. They didn't understand what God was saying, just like the first version. I'm on point 3. So they had to have Daniel come in, and he was able to interpret. But that's not the only time the finger of God. The 10 Commandments, God wrote those. If you go back to, let's see, Exodus 32, Exodus 31, you see that God says, which I have written, who was God's. Let me go back there. I want to make this somewhat thorough. Okay. So I'm doing a little Bible flipping myself. I didn't mark all of these because there's a lot to be marked, but this is how God speaks. I'm starting with the biggest ways, and I'm working down to, I don't want to say God speaks big ways and little ways. I'm saying from human perspective, I'm starting what seems to be the big ways, working down to smaller ways. Human perspective, God speaking is big, period. Let me say it again. God speaking is big, just period. All right, so if I go to 32:16, the tablets were God's work, and the writing was God's writing engraved on the tablets. Okay, let me go to another one. 24:12. This is another example of, this is point number 3 I'm on. I'm on point 3 of the 12 ways God speaks. So we can begin to identify, how's God speaking to me? And though God may not be speaking these ways, these are ways that God has spoken. Let's just begin identifying them. All right. All this gets fun. This is going to be great fun. Now the Lord said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain and stay there, and I will give you the stone tablets with the law and the commandments, which I have written for their instruction. Okay, so we know God writes. That's going to be important for the one later on the next part of this series. So here's the 3 ways. God speaks, boom, from the heavens. Then God speaks from whirlwinds, from clouds, right? Then 3, God speaks with his own finger of handwriting. All right, let me go to 4. God can speak directly, face to face, not from the heavens. God speaks face to face. So what's interesting is in Exodus, you see that God spoke to Moses face to face. Moses would set a tent out, and whenever the pillar of God would come down, a cloud would cover the tent. Moses would walk into the tent, and whenever the cloud would come down, it says God would visit Moses inside the tent and speak to him face to face and tell him things. Man, that's exciting. Do you see how it's getting closer for the big boom of heaven, that we're getting closer, that God speaks face to face? I've heard testimonies in the Middle East where Muslims are saying they're being visited by Jesus. Do you hear that? And it came about, this is Exodus 33:8. Let me read it to you. Right? Okay, it says here, and it came about whenever Moses went out to the tent that all the people would arise and stand, each at the entrance of the tent, and gaze after Moses until he entered inside the tent. Whenever Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak to Moses face to face. Wow, that's good stuff. This is how God is. Oh man, this is good for people who want to hear it. All right, so that was number 4. I'm going to stop there, and I will make this a multiple part series. There's 12 ways, so maybe 3 parts. That's 4. Those are the big ways that we've heard. I'm going to continue this next week on the ways that God speaks, and it's going to get to the place where we can start hearing how God's speaking to us now for those who are seeking and wanting to know. God bless. Share this if you want. Be a media missionary. Let's spread God's word. Isn't that the most important thing we should be doing? God bless you guys.